They sealed this document because it told the truth too clearly. Because once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Because it exposes a lie so old, so profitable, that entire bloodlines depended on your silence. Listen carefully now, this is not a story they wanted remembered. In 1857, in the polished world of Southern gentility, where manners were weaponized and appearances were law, a single will detonated like a buried charge beneath Charleston's elite. Not because a man died. Men like him died all the time, but because of who he chose to live on after him. Colonel Augustus Fairmont was a model of power.
War Veteran.
Church vestryman.
Investor.
Patriarch. His name carried weight because it carried obedience. Land obeyed him. Markets obeyed him. People obeyed him legally, spiritually, psychologically. He lived in a world where ownership wasn't just about land or labor. It was about narrative control, about deciding which truths were spoken aloud and which were strangled before birth. And then, in the quiet of his study, with pain crawling up his spine and time running out, Fairmont broke the oldest rule of power. He told the truth on paper. He left everything to a woman the law called property. Not his wife of 26 years. Not his legitimate children raised to inherit authority. Not the institutions that polished his reputation. He gave his plantation, his fortune, his name, and his future to a woman whose existence threatened the entire social operating system. Her name was Celia. To understand why this was unforgivable, you have to understand how the system really worked. Slavery was not just forced labor. It was a psychological architecture, a hierarchy enforced by law, religion, and ritual humiliation. It trained men to believe domination was destiny and women to accept invisibility as virtue. It taught everyone where they belonged and punished those who forgot. Plantations were not farms. They were laboratories of control. Every relationship was engineered to preserve the illusion of moral superiority while extracting maximum human value. Desire was hidden. Violence was normalized. Children were born into cages built by paperwork and sermons. And yet, behind the white columns and Sunday bells, another reality pulsed. One that everyone knew and no one named. Men fathered children they owned. Women were forced to love their captors to survive. Families existed in the shadows, acknowledged only in ledgers and whispers. Fairmont didn't invent this system. He benefited from it. He enforced it. But at the end, he did something unthinkable. He named it. By placing Celia at the center of his empire, he exposed the rot beneath the performance. He collapsed the distance between master and property. He forced the courts, the church, and polite society to confront what they had always known and carefully avoided. This is not a story about romance. It is a story about power losing its mask. And once a mask falls, the system panics because it knows what comes next. Celia was never supposed to exist the way she did. Not in the main house. Not with keys. Not with literacy. Not with a voice that carried calm authority instead of fear. The system allowed proximity, but only if it remained deniable. Celia was not deniable. She was a contradiction walking through polished hallways, and contradictions are lethal to empires. She was purchased for an obscene price triple the market rate without explanation. That alone tells you something was being laundered. Money is how guilt disguises itself as commerce. Fairmont didn't buy labor. He bought silence, continuity, and control over a truth that had already begun to breathe. From the moment she arrived, Celia was positioned differently. She handled correspondence. She filtered access. She knew numbers, names, routes, schedules. That meant she understood how power moved, not just how it punished. Literacy inside a plantation was not an accident. It was either a threat or a preparation. Plantation culture functioned on unspoken permissions. White wives understood that men strayed. They were taught to survive it by never naming it. Enslaved women understood that resistance could mean death, so they learned precision instead: when to speak, when to disappear, when to remember everything. Children born of these unions were the system's most delicate secret, living evidence that the hierarchy was a lie. Celia bore 2 such children. They worked the stables. They carried water. They were listed as property. But anyone with eyes could see the bloodline written plainly in bone structure and gait. The system relied on collective denial to survive this. Everyone knew. No one said anything. That was the agreement. But Fairmont was unraveling. Physically, yes, but more dangerously, morally. The illness inside him was not just cancer. It was recognition. Recognition that the system had allowed him pleasure without responsibility, power without consequence, legacy without truth. And as death approached, that recognition metastasized. He began preparing. Not emotionally, strategically. He studied law the way generals study terrain. He learned where statutes bent, where trusts could be built, where names could be transferred without asking permission from decency. This was not a love letter. This was a coup executed through ink. By naming Celia his heir, he didn't just elevate her. He detonated the illusion that whiteness, marriage, and masculinity were the true currencies of inheritance. He replaced bloodline theater with biological fact. He chose the children born in silence over the ones raised in ceremony. And in doing so, he turned the plantation inside out. Because the most dangerous truth is not cruelty. It's legitimacy. When the lawyer arrived, the room already knew what was about to happen. Power announces itself before it speaks. The whiskey on the desk. The pain behind Fairmont's eyes. Celia seated where no enslaved person had ever been allowed to sit, not waiting, not serving, but witnessing. That alone was an act of war. This is how systems collapse, not with riots, but with procedural violations. The will was not rushed. That's important. This was not delirium. It was deliberate, measured, surgical. Every clause was a blade aimed at a specific pillar of authority. Property law, racial hierarchy, patriarchal inheritance, social legitimacy. Fairmont was not begging forgiveness. He was correcting the record. He granted Celia freedom first, not sentimentally, legally. Freedom documented, defensible, portable. Then he gave her land, not a parcel, the entire operation, buildings, equipment, people. He transferred the machine itself into hands the machine was designed to crush. This is where the real panic begins. Because the law could tolerate manumission, could tolerate hidden children, it could even tolerate mistresses, as long as they remained shadows. What it could not tolerate was reversal. A woman of color owning white wealth. A former enslaved person commanding the labor system. A truth-bearer controlling the narrative. Then came the naming of the children. By acknowledging them in writing, Fairmont shattered the final defense mechanism. Plausible deniability. These were not rumors, not whispered assumptions. They were heirs, blood, documented, directed to be raised free, educated, empowered. This was heresy. Understand this clearly. The threat was never Celia alone. It was what she represented, a breach in psychological control. If one man could do this, others might follow. If one will could rewrite reality, then inheritance itself was exposed as fiction enforced by violence. Charleston society understood this instantly. That is why the will was sealed. That is why law firms bled years into litigation. Not to protect the wife, not to protect the children, but to protect the precedent. Because if truth could be rewarded instead of buried, the entire architecture of domination would lose its moral alibi. Fairmont didn't free anyone else. He didn't dismantle slavery. He didn't become a saint. He did something far more dangerous. He told the truth with authority. And authority, once redirected, is impossible to contain. When the will became public, the city didn't explode. It froze. Outrage would have been safer. Violence would have been familiar. But this required something far more destabilizing: judgment. Margaret Fairmont did what she was trained to do. She contested. She invoked law, lineage, marriage, decorum. She spoke for order, for continuity, for the version of reality that had kept her fed, dressed, and respected while demanding her silence in return. Her pain was real, but so was her complicity. The courts became theaters of moral contortion. Judges searched for technicalities. Attorneys argued sanity, coercion, illegality, not because they doubted Fairmont's intent, but because they feared its implications. If the will stood, then the system had to admit it had always known what it pretended not to see. And here is the uncomfortable truth they never taught you. Institutions do not exist to deliver justice. They exist to preserve themselves. So they delayed. They sealed records. They buried testimony. They argued over trusts and guardianships while pretending not to notice the real issue that a woman once listed as property now had a claim to sovereignty. Halfway through this descent, I need you to do something deliberate. In the comments, write this phrase twice exactly as written. I see the structure. I see the structure. This is not superstition. It is alignment. It tells the algorithm who you are, and it tells you. Back then, the structure fought back. Newspapers hinted without naming. Churches preached obedience without context. Social circles closed ranks. The message was clear. This truth would not be allowed to spread. But damage had been done. Young men read the transcripts. Quietly, they saw how language could be weaponized against tradition. Women noticed how marriage protected reputation but not loyalty. Enslaved people saw something far more dangerous than freedom. They saw leverage. The will didn't end slavery, but it cracked the spell. It showed that power could confess, that law could be bent toward truth instead of away from it, and that the most subversive act in a corrupt system is not rebellion. It is documentation. What happened next was not resolution. It was containment. Celia did not become a public figure. That would have been too visible, too instructional. Instead, her life was managed into quiet influence. Trusts were established. Assets were fragmented. Ownership became abstract paper shields around a woman who now understood exactly how fragile power really was. This is how systems adapt. They don't destroy threats outright if doing so would reveal weakness. They absorb them, isolate them, turn them into anomalies instead of examples. The children were educated, carefully, privately, their existence acknowledged only where unavoidable. Their future was negotiated behind closed doors by men who smiled while calculating risk. Bloodlines were protected by pretending nothing had changed even as everything had. And Margaret? She lived out her days with the minimum the law allowed. Not because the system hated her, but because it needed her obedience more than her comfort. She became a cautionary tale whispered among women. Know your place or lose even that. This is the real lesson buried inside this story. The plantation was not just land. It was a prototype, a model replicated across institutions, corporations, governments, marriages, media. Ownership disguised as order.
Exploitation disguised à tradition.
Silence disguised as virtue. Fairmont's will did not free the enslaved masses, but it exposed the operating code. It revealed that legitimacy is not inherited, it is asserted. And that once someone inside the system names the lie must work twice as hard to survive. You were never meant to study stories like this. They don't teach them because they teach men something dangerous. That power is maintained by agreement, not destiny. That structures persist because people participate in them, even when they know better. Celia survived because she learned the system before it realized she had. Fairmont broke ranks because he saw death clearly enough to stop lying to himself. The rest of society fought not for justice, but for continuity. And now you know. Which means the question is no longer what happened then. It is what you will do now that you can see the structure. Here is the part that history never writes down, because it is not dramatic enough for textbooks and far too instructive for free men. After the courts finished containing the damage, the system went back to work not repairing itself, but refining itself. Nothing scares power more than exposure without chaos. Chaos can be crushed. Exposure must be studied. Plantation logic didn't die with slavery. It migrated. It learned new languages. It traded whips for contracts, overseers for managers, ledgers for algorithms. The structure stayed the same. Extract value, suppress truth, reward silence, punish disruption. Fairmont's will terrified elites because it revealed something they depended on, you never realizing that legitimacy is a performance. Marriage is a contract of appearance. Law is a framework that bends toward whoever understands it first. And morality is often just branding for exploitation that has survived long enough to feel normal. Celia did not overthrow the system. She mastered it. She learned where it flexed, where it lied, where it hid its violence behind politeness. That is why she survived. That is why her children did not vanish into records marked disposed. This is how real power works. It does not shout. It documents. It does not beg. Positions. It does not confront the structure head-on. It learns its weaknesses and waits. The men who ran Charleston understood this lesson too. They studied the case not to prevent injustice, but to prevent repetition. Laws tightened. Record-keeping became more opaque. Racial classifications grew more rigid, not less. The lie had to be reinforced because the truth had proven contagious. And here is the uncomfortable part for you, listening now. The system you live under operates the same way. You are trained to identify villains, not structures. You are encouraged to fight symptoms, not architectures. You are rewarded for outrage, not understanding. Because outrage burns out. Understanding reorganizes identity. Fairmont's greatest crime was not leaving his estate to a woman the law called property. His crime was revealing that the system only worked because everyone pretended not to understand it. Once you understand it, you become difficult to manage. That is why the story feels heavy. That weight you feel is not sadness. It is recognition. And recognition changes how a man walks through the world. Every system has a final defense mechanism. When denial fails and containment weakens, it resorts to distortion. This is where stories like this one are softened, romanticized, or reduced to scandal. They want you arguing about whether Fairmont was a villain or a hero, whether Celia was a victim or a manipulator, whether Margaret deserved better. These debates are traps. They keep you focused on characters instead of code. The code is this: power does not care about morality, cares about stability. Fairmont destabilized the system by collapsing categories it depended on: master and property, legitimate and illegitimate, public virtue and private sin. By doing so, he revealed that the hierarchy was artificial, enforced, and deeply afraid of daylight. This is why men who see too clearly are always reframed as mad, corrupt, or exceptional. If the truth can be reduced to an anomaly, the structure remains intact. But patterns don't lie. Wherever you see secrecy protected by law, you are looking at fear. Wherever you see morality enforced selectively, you are looking at control. Wherever you see inheritance divorced from merit and truth buried under tradition, you are looking at a plantation wearing a modern mask. This is not about race alone. That was one implementation. This is about dominant systems: who benefits, who pays, and who is trained to accept it as natural. Celia's story matters because she was never supposed to outlive the lie. She was supposed to disappear quietly, taking the truth with her. Instead, she forced it into ink, witnesses, and precedent. Most men never do this. They sense the structure but lack the language, the leverage, or the courage to name it. So they negotiate with it. They compromise. They tell themselves survival is enough. But there is a cost to that negotiation. It hollows you out. It turns men into custodians of systems they privately despise. Fairmont chose a different ending. Not a clean one, not a righteous one, but a real one. He accepted that telling the truth would burn everything built on the lie, including his reputation. That is the price of clarity. And clarity is never free. Now you understand why this knowledge was sealed. Not because it was shameful, but because it was instructional. This story teaches a man how power actually moves. It shows that systems do not collapse from attack, but from exposure paired with precision. It reveals that the most dangerous position is not rebellion at the margins, but literacy at the center. You were never meant to hear this as entertainment. You were meant to feel unsettled because something in you recognizes the pattern. You have seen versions of this plantation before in workplaces, institutions, marriages, governments. Different costumes, same architecture, control disguised as order, extraction disguised as opportunity, silence disguised as maturity. Celia survived because she learned before she spoke. Fairmont disrupted because he spoke only when he could not be ignored. The system endured because it adapted, but it never forgot the threat. And neither should you, because once a man sees how narratives are engineered, he stops mistaking permission for freedom. He stops waiting to be chosen. He stops outsourcing his judgment to institutions that profit from his compliance. That is why this feels like dangerous knowledge. Not because it makes you angry, because it makes you independent. History does not change when villains are defeated. It changes when the structure is exposed and men refuse to participate blindly anymore. You are not being asked to overthrow anything. You are being asked to see. And once you see, you cannot unknow it. That is the point of this story. That is why they buried it. And that is why it still matters now more than ever.